Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So, think the way the world works now. Countries interacting, trade, international rules is purely a Western invention.
Yeah, that's a common thought.
Well, prepare to have that picture flipped on its head. Today we're digging into Amitav Acharya's The Once and Future World Order.
It's a really interesting book, nonfiction, sort of history meets political science.
Exactly, and it basically argues that the global system we have isn't just from Europe and North America. Far from it, actually.
Yeah, the core idea is that loads of different civilizations chipped in over time. It suggests that maybe this long period of Western dominance is shifting, and, well, we need to understand that shift.
Right. It's like the book is tackling this kind of historical amnesia about all the non-Western contributions.
Precisely. He sees the international order less as a Western blueprint and more like a mosaic. Different pieces from different places and times.
I loved that aspect. The way it uncovered non-Western roots for things I always thought were, Western. Diplomacy, trade ideas.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big one for me, too. The sheer historical sweep, going through so many different cultures and seeing their contributions laid out.
Yeah, that historical detail was amazing. Though, I'll admit, sometimes it felt like, wow, this is a lot of information.
I get that. It can be dense. You definitely need to pay attention because some arguments are quite complex, quite nuanced.
True. And because it covers so much ground, some parts maybe feel a bit less explored than others. But that's probably unavoidable with such a big scope.
Fair point. But back to the core, this idea that concepts like diplomacy or trade principles didn't just spring up in Enlightenment Europe.
Exactly. Acharya takes us way back. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, then Persia, India, China, the Islamic world, even Africa and pre-Columbian America.
Showing how all these societies had their own ways of thinking about order, peace, interacting with neighbors.
It really challenges that whole Western exceptionalism idea, doesn't it? The notion that the West somehow uniquely invented the rules for international relations.
Totally. The book digs into how different cultures faced similar problems, organizing politically, managing relations between groups, setting up rules of behavior.
What really jumped out at me early on was how he finds non-Western origins for stuff we link to the West, like early Mesopotamia and Egypt.
Right, the emergence of something that looks a lot like independent states.
Yeah, and divine rulers, even early cooperation between big powers. It makes you rethink where the basic building blocks actually come from.
So what specifically stood out from those early examples?
Well, those Amarna letters.
Yeah.
The messages between rulers in the ancient Near East, they show a surprisingly sophisticated diplomatic setup.
Expectations of give and take, mutual respect.
Right. Like that king of Babylon complaining to the pharaoh about a cheap gift. It sounds so human. So much like today's diplomacy, just thousands of years earlier.
And importantly, between non-Western powers.
Exactly. It suggests these fundamental challenges of how states get along, the need for rules. It's not unique to one culture or time.
And Acharya stresses that these developments aren't isolated. There's always borrowing, adapting across cultures.
Like Akkadian becoming the diplomatic language back then. That's a great example of that exchange.
Precisely.
But it wasn't all cooperation, obviously. The book talks about empires rising, like Sargon of Akkad.
The empire concept, a recurring theme.
Yeah, and the justification was often about bringing order to chaos. We see that story again and again, right?
That chaos versus order narrative is key. It often legitimized rulers, framing them as needed, even divinely chosen, to impose order. And, well, to expand their power.
It shows how ideas about legitimacy and power were linked way back then across different cultures.
Definitely.
Another thing I found really interesting was the discussion on divine monarchy.
Oh, yeah.
Acharya argues it's been like the most common and lasting political system ever, popping up everywhere.
Pharaohs, Indian god kings, European divine right.
Exactly. This idea of rule being backed by a higher power just kept going. What does that tell us?
Well, it does make you wonder about how societies historically saw authority and stability. Maybe a deep need to look beyond just human power for legitimacy.
Interesting point. Now, shifting slightly ancient Greece, the book makes you rethink that too.
How so? We usually see it as the birthplace of democracy and Western thought.
Right, but Acharya argues we often overplay Greece's uniqueness and downplay its links to older civilizations, like Egypt and Mesopotamia.
So the idea is that Western thought has more diverse non-Western roots than we usually admit.
Pretty much, he emphasizes Greece as a Mediterranean civilization, with lots of interaction with Africa and Asia, not just some isolated European ancestor.
That selective view does tend to ignore those connections.
And it wasn't just ideas. He points out Greek colonization was often different from, say, Persian or Indian influence spreading.
Different how?
Greek colonization often seemed more focused on keeping a distinct Greek identity, less on cultural mixing.
Ah, interesting. Compared to, say, Indian culture spreading in Southeast Asia, which often blended with local traditions.
Exactly. It highlights different approaches empires took to expansion and dealing with other peoples.
That comparison is quite revealing.
And Persia, the book really flips the script on the usual Persia versus democratic Greece narrative.
Yeah, often painted as the total opposite.
But Acharya highlights their indirect rule, letting cultures keep customs, even supporting Greek thinkers in Anatolia. He quotes Plato praising Persian freedom of speech under Cyrus.
Wow, that's definitely not the standard picture.
Makes you wonder how much perspective shapes history, doesn't it?
It certainly challenges inherited narratives and their potential biases. Persia shows there were different ways to run an empire, maybe more focused on accommodation sometimes.
Then there's ancient India. The book covers republican traditions, the Ghana Sanghas with assemblies, voting.
And Ashoka's ethical rule based on Buddhist ideas.
Right. Ashoka turning to nonviolence after that brutal war. It's such a different leadership model.
It shows these ideas about republics and ethical governance weren't just Western. They have roots elsewhere, too.
Ashoka's focus on ethics and people's welfare, laid out in his edicts, is a powerful early example of morality and governance. Stands out against the usual focus on conquest.
It really does.
And Indian philosophy, like the Samkhya school, suggesting natural explanations for the universe, not divine ones. That was another eye-opener.
Seeing that kind of rational, secular thinking emerging outside the West so early on.
It suggests that trying to understand the world through reason is, well, a global thing with diverse origins, not just a Greek thing that led to Western science.
Fascinating to see those parallel tracks of inquiry across civilizations. It just underlines that curiosity isn't confined to one tradition.
Okay, then China. A long, complex history of world order concepts there.
The mandate of heaven, Tianxia.
Yeah, the mandate of heaven legitimizing rule based on governing justly, caring for the people. And Tianxia thinking of the whole world as the unit, aiming for harmony. Very different from the Westphalian state system.
How would you say the key difference plays out?
Well, the Chinese concepts seem to lean towards a hierarchical order, but one that's potentially morally accountable. Westphalia is more about equal, sovereign states not interfering with each other.
And the mandate of heaven allowed for rebellion against bad rulers, right? Which is different from the more absolute divine right of kings in Europe.
Good point. And Tianxia, focusing on harmony, is just a different vibe than the Western focus on state competition.
It's interesting, too, how some of those Chinese ideas influenced Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, like Voltaire, seeing China as a model of rational rule.
It really highlights the connections, doesn't it? How non-Western ideas shaped Western thought, even if it's not always acknowledged.
Definitely underscores that point.
Moving to the Islamic world, the book details its huge expansion and becoming this major learning hub when Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages.
The translation work, preserving Greek, Persian, Indian texts, crucial.
Absolutely. And the contributions of Islamic scholars, plus concepts like ijtihad, that independent reasoning in law, showing intellectual energy.
And places like Cordoba with the convivencia.
Yeah, that peaceful coexistence between religions. A powerful contrast to religious conflicts in Europe then. What's the lasting impact? Well, that knowledge transfer was vital for the European Renaissance.
Fundamental, really.
Yeah.
The preservation, advancement, and transmission of knowledge to Europe set the stage for so much later development.
The book also looks at the Indian Ocean trade network, thriving for centuries without one dominant power controlling it.
That idea of the sea as a shared space.
So different from the European approach, which often became about dominance and control. That quote from the Sultan of Goa, "God made the sea common," sums it up perfectly.
It suggests stable, prosperous global systems can exist without one big boss, one hegemon.
Yeah, the system relied more on shared institutions' mutual interests.
Yeah.
But then the Europeans arrived.
Seeking monopolies, using force, fundamentally changing that more open system.
Which brings us to colonialism, a huge theme. Acharya details how exploiting the Americas, especially with the slave trade, fueled Europe's rise.
The sheer amount of resources, silver especially, pouring into Europe.
It reshaped economies. but, as the book stresses, at a horrific cost to indigenous peoples in the Americas.
The Aztec example, their sophistication surprising Cortez, really highlights the tragedy.
So the takeaway about the West's rise, it was deeply tied to exploiting and subjugating other parts of the world.
Inextricably linked. That wealth transfer was a critical foundation for Europe's later dominance.
And Africa's contributions often ignored in Western histories. But Acharya points to empires like Ghana and Mali.
Complex political and cultural system.
Right, and principles of justice in some African traditions too. It shows the history of governance is much richer than a purely Western view suggests.
It really challenges that idea of Africa being somehow less developed before Europeans showed up.
But the slave trade and then the scramble for Africa were catastrophic.
Disrupting societies, economies. Those arbitrary borders drawn in Berlin still cause problems today.
That colonial period cast a very long shadow, lasting instability, economic challenges.
A profound and enduring legacy.
The book highlights a crucial double standard with the Peace of Westphalia.
How so?
Well, it set up this anti-hegemonic order in Europe based on sovereign states, while at the same time, European powers ramped up colonization outside Europe. Peace at home, subjugation abroad.
That's a critical tension, isn't it? A fundamental contradiction in how the modern system developed.
And the standard of civilization concept justified this inequality, dividing the world into civilized and not based on racist criteria.
Japan's attempt to join the club by westernizing is a fascinating, if complicated, example of navigating that.
Yeah, it shows the pressure on non-Western nations to conform just to get recognition.
Underscores the power dynamics and the costs involved.
Racism is another key thread, obviously tied to colonialism and slavery. Acharya shows how European thinkers even justified slavery, how racial hierarchies got baked into Western structures, like in the U.S.
Even with its ideals, the U.S. had its own civilizing mission against Native Americans, and the Monroe Doctrine asserting dominance.
It mirrors European spheres of influence, and the shadow of that racism, it still shapes global inequalities today.
A long and damaging legacy, absolutely.
The book also questions if the post-WWII American liberal order was ever truly universal or equally good for everyone.
More like a club good for certain nations.
Exactly. And now, the rise of powers like China and India is challenging that order, pushing towards a more multipolar world.
The Bandung Conference back in '55 was a key moment there.
Right. Newly independent nations speaking up, linking colonialism, human rights, racism, a real assertion of non-Western agency.
A turning point, pushing back against Western dominance, setting a different agenda.
So ultimately, Acharya argues the current world order isn't just Western, it's shared, with input from many places. The shift away from Western dominance might not be bad, could lead to something more inclusive.
He talks about a multiplex world, multiple power centers, different nations leading on different issues.
Yeah. And he seems skeptical that China, for instance, could or would recreate a purely Sino-centric system. The world's just too diverse now.
The likely future seems more complex, more multipolar than the last few centuries, a more diffused power structure.
So, after digging into all this history, my final take on the once-and-future world order, I found it incredibly insightful, really challenged my assumptions.
It does make you think differently.
The sheer amount of history was impressive. Like I said, maybe a bit dense sometimes, needed focus.
Understandable.
But the way it presented this nuanced view on Western dominance, its rise, its potential shift, really thought-provoking. So for that eye-opening journey, I'm giving it a solid 4.5 out of 5 stars.
It definitely encourages a more critical, more inclusive look at global history and where we might be heading.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? It's that the way the world works comes from contributions all over, not just one corner.
A truly global story.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. If this discussion got you interested and you want to check out Amitav Acharya's The Once and Future World Order yourself, there's an Amazon link down in the description.
And please do like and subscribe to the show for more discussions like this.
We hope this gave you maybe a new angle on global history and what's happening now.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. We'd love to know what struck you the most. Was there a favorite moment or something that really surprised you from this whole discussion about world order history?
Let us know in the comments.
Please do. Share your thoughts below. And yeah, like and share this deep dive so we can keep the conversation going.
Definitely.
And maybe just think about this. How might understanding all these diverse historical contributions change how we look at global challenges today and the world order yet to come?
A good thought to end on.
Until our next deep dive.